Dr. Grace Nakamura had spent her entire career at the threshold. Not the threshold of death, the other one. The one on the other side. As an obstetrician specializing in high-risk pregnancies, she had been present at more than 4,000 births. She had held lives in her hands at the exact moment they crossed from one state of being to another. She had watched, more times than she could count, the particular quality of transition that happens in the seconds after a newborn takes its first breath. The shift from one kind of existence to another, the arrival of a presence that had not been fully present a moment before. She had always found this extraordinary. She had never had a framework for what it meant. She was 49 years old when a ruptured ectopic pregnancy sent her into hemorrhagic shock during a routine surgical procedure. She was dead for 11 minutes, and what she found on the other side was not what she expected. Not the patients she had lost, not the babies who had not survived, not the structure of consciousness or the geometry of the afterlife. She found the ones who were waiting to arrive. The consciousnesses that had not yet crossed the threshold she had spent 21 years standing beside. She found them prepared, purposeful, and carrying a quality of collective intention that she came back unable to describe in any language except one word. Ready. My name is Alex. This is Beyond the Veil. And today we visit the most forward-looking account in this series. Every previous episode has been about what exists on the other side of death. This one is about what exists on the other side of birth. Dr. Grace Nakamura did not come back with information about the past or about the eternal present of another state of being. She came back with something rarer, information about what is coming, about who is coming, and about why the world they are arriving into is going to be different from the one we have been living in. Stay with me, because what Grace saw changes not just how we think about death. It changes how we think about the children already here, and the ones on their way. Grace grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii, the daughter of Japanese-American parents who had both been born in the internment camps during World War II and who had emerged from that experience with a particular quality of attention to the preciousness of ordinary life. Her parents did not talk much about the camps. What they gave her instead was a household where nothing was taken for granted, where meals were occasions, where the arrival of a healthy child was celebrated with a depth of gratitude that Grace understood only much later was connected to the knowledge that such arrivals were not guaranteed. Her grandmother had lost a child in the camps, a boy, 6 months old, in the winter of 1943. Her grandmother had spoken of him only once to Grace, when Grace was in medical school, and had told her what she intended to specialize in. Her grandmother had taken her hand and said, "You will be in the rooms where the ones that make it through arrive. Take care of them. Every one of them made it through something to get here." Grace had not known then what her grandmother meant. She understood it completely now. She decided she wanted to be in those rooms. Not because birth was joyful. She understood earlier than most that it was not always joyful. Sometimes it was terrifying. Sometimes it was the beginning of grief. But it was always significant. Always the moment where one state became another. She studied medicine at the University of Hawaii, completed her residency in obstetrics at UCSF. Subspecialized in maternal-fetal medicine, the branch that dealt with the pregnancies most likely to go wrong, the ones where the margin between arrival and not arrival was thinnest. She had chosen this subspecialty deliberately, not out of affinity for crisis, out of the conviction that the cases where the threshold was most precarious were the cases where her presence mattered most. She married Kenji at 32, a marine biologist who studied coral reef ecosystems and who shared, she said, her particular fascination with the moments of transition between states. He studied the ecosystems at the boundaries, the places where one ecological zone became another, where the rules changed and the organisms adapted or didn't. They had found each other at a conference where she was presenting on fetal transition physiology and he was presenting on reef recovery after bleaching events, and they had spent 3 hours after the panel talking about thresholds. They had never been able to have children of their own. This had been the great grief of her adult life, the one she had learned over many years to carry without letting it bend her posture. She had brought it to the work instead. She had been more present in every delivery room because of it, not less. The babies she received had mattered more than they might have otherwise because they could not be taken for granted in the specific way that the parents in the room were able to take them for granted. She had made a kind of peace with this. The particular piece of someone who has learned to find meaning in what they have rather than what they were denied. Her grandmother would have understood. She was 49 years old, in her 21st year of practice, when the ectopic pregnancy ruptured during what should have been a straightforward procedure. Her team responded with the efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this: 11 minutes. Kenji received the call at his research station. He drove to the hospital with the particular quality of focused calm that he had developed over years of marine fieldwork. The ability to function precisely in situations where functioning precisely was the only useful thing available to him. Grace was in surgery when he arrived. He sat in a waiting room and thought about coral reefs, not to distract himself. Because coral reefs, the way they regenerated after bleaching events, the way the ecosystem rebuilt itself from remnants that had survived what looked like total destruction, had always given him a framework for thinking about things that seemed irreversible. Grace regained consciousness 16 hours later. She looked at Kenji. She said, "I saw them." He said, "Saw who?" She said, "The ones who are coming." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Tell me everything." She talked for 4 hours. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That explains something I've been watching in the reef data." She looked at him. He said, "The juveniles. The ones that survived the last bleaching event. They're doing something the older generation didn't do." She said, "What?" He said, "Adapting faster than the models predicted." They looked at each other. Neither said what they were both thinking. Not yet. Grace left her body the way she had watched hundreds of patients leave theirs, with a completeness that was neither violent nor gradual, but simply total. She was above the operating room. She noted the positions of her team. She noted the specific instruments in use, the stage of the procedure, the readings on the monitors. She noted, with the professional attention of a surgeon observing her own case, that the team was managing the situation correctly. She noted her own face. She had not known what her own face looked like during surgery. She had spent 21 years on the other side of that expression, watching the faces of patients who were somewhere between one state and another. From above, she recognized the expression. It was the one she had always watched for, the one that meant the person was still present but somewhere partly else. And then, the operating room was gone. What replaced it was not the light she had heard described in the accounts she had accumulated over 21 years of quiet interest in what patients sometimes reported from the edges of consciousness. What replaced it was a place she recognized, not from any prior experience, from the feeling she associated with threshold, the particular quality of a space between one state and another, the quality she had spent 21 years standing beside. The first thing Grace perceived was presence. Not the presence of beings in the sense she had encountered in the accounts of other near-death experiencers, the luminous figures, the beloved dead, the presences of light and warmth. This was something different. This was the presence of those who had not yet arrived. She understood this immediately, and with a certainty that she has never been able to fully account for, not as a conclusion she reached, but as a recognition. The way you recognize a face before you have consciously identified who it is. These were consciousnesses preparing to cross the threshold from the other direction. She had spent 21 years at the threshold from the side of arrival. She was now at the threshold from the side of departure, the side where the ones who were coming gathered before they came. The quality of presence was not what she had expected. She had expected, if she had expected anything, a quality of innocence, of blankness. The consciousness before experience, unformed, waiting to be shaped by what would happen to it. What she found was the opposite. These consciousnesses were not unformed. They were the most complete presences she had encountered in the entire experience, and she had, by that point, encountered several. They carried a quality of having come from somewhere, of having existed before, and of carrying that existence into the new form they were preparing to take. They were not blank. They were prepared. She moved toward the nearest one. The communication that occurred, she is precise about this, always, was not in the form of a conversation, not question and answer, something closer to direct understanding, the way you understand a piece of music without translating it into language, the way you understand, standing in a doorway, whether the room you are about to enter is occupied. The room was occupied, fully, completely, by a presence that carried more history than its apparent preparedness for birth suggested. What she understood, without words, without sequence, was this. This consciousness had been here before, not in a vague metaphorical sense, not in the sense of a soul that had always existed in some abstract eternal realm, in the specific sense of having occupied a physical form on this planet, having lived, having returned to this side after that life ended, and having decided, having actively, deliberately decided to return. Not forced, not assigned, chosen. She is emphatic on this word every time she tells this account. Chosen. Because she understood that the alternative, the consciousness as passive recipient of birth, assigned randomly to whatever family happened to be available, was simply not what she was inside. These were not passengers waiting for a train. They were travelers who had selected their destination. She asked, without words, why this destination? Why this family? Why this body? Why now? The answer she received was the thing she came back unable to fully describe. Not because it was vague, but because it was too specific for any language she had available. It was something about the moment, the particular quality of this moment in the long arc of human experience. She had been a careful student of her own historical moment. Kenji had taught her to think in ecological timescales, and she had applied that thinking to human civilization. She understood that the period they were living in was unusual, that the rate of change was accelerating, that the challenges accumulating were of a kind that previous generations had not faced in the same combination, that the window for certain kinds of adaptation was specific and not indefinite. The consciousnesses around her knew this. They had chosen it. They were choosing this particular moment the way an experienced mountaineer chooses a challenging route, not despite the difficulty but because of it. Because the difficulty was the thing that made the arrival meaningful. She stayed with this for a long time. Then she asked, without words, what they were coming to do. The specific quality of the moment that humanity was currently inside, the particular configuration of challenges and possibilities, and the window of transformation that this specific period represented. She received this not as a prophecy, not as a message she was being asked to carry, as a context, the way a briefing provides context for a mission that is already underway. The consciousnesses she was among had not been sent. They had volunteered. For this particular moment, she moved further into the gathering. What she found, moving through the presences of those preparing to arrive, was a quality she can only describe as collective, not uniform. Each consciousness was distinct, individual, carrying its own particular quality and history and intention, but oriented, in the way that individual instruments in an orchestra are distinct and yet participating in something that none of them produces alone. She understood that what she was inside was not a random collection of souls waiting their turn to be born into whatever circumstances happened to be available. It was something more deliberate than that, more organized. She is careful about this. She does not claim to have been shown a divine plan or a predetermined script. She is too precise for that kind of claim. What she says is this: the consciousnesses preparing to arrive were not passive. They were choosing. Choosing families, choosing circumstances, choosing the specific combination of challenge and capacity that would allow them to do what they had come to do. And what they had come to do, what she understood as the collective intention of the gathering she was inside, it was not simple, not comfortable, not the arrival of a generation that would make the world easier, the arrival of a generation that would make the world different. She understood that the transformation was already underway, that the children already born in the last decade and a half were the leading edge of something that the children still preparing to arrive were the continuation of. She found the ones who were closest to crossing, the ones who would arrive in the next months, the next years. She cannot describe what she found in them without reaching for a word she has never used in all her years of clinical practice. She calls it readiness, not the readiness of a body prepared for birth. She knew that readiness from the inside of the work, the specific physiological preparations that preceded delivery. A different readiness, the readiness of a consciousness that knows where it is going, has prepared for it, and is choosing, in full awareness of the difficulty of what it is choosing, to go. She stayed with several of them individually. She cannot describe them in terms that map onto physical characteristics. They had not yet taken on the physical form that would define how they appeared in the world. What she could perceive was the quality of their intention, the specific combination of capacity and challenge they were bringing. One she describes as carrying an extraordinary ability to hold complexity without needing to resolve it, the capacity to sit inside contradictions that would have broken previous generations and find the synthesis that neither side of the contradiction could see. One she describes as carrying a quality of directness, an inability to perform that would make them seem strange in the world they were arriving into, and would make them, she understood, exactly what the world needed. One she describes simply as carrying an unusual amount of love, not the performed love of someone trying to be good. The structural love of someone for whom care for others was not an achievement, but a mode of being. She asked without words what the transformation was. What all of this choosing, all of this preparation, all of this deliberate arrival into a specific difficult moment was in service of. The answer she received was not a prediction in the sense of an event that would occur on a specific date. It was more like a direction, away from the dominance of fear as the primary organizing principle of human society, away from the use of separation, the construction of us and them, the protection of identity through the diminishment of other identities, as the primary tool of social organization, towards something she received as a quality rather than as a concept, a quality she associates with the best moments she has witnessed in delivery rooms, when the chaos of a difficult birth resolves and the child arrives and the room undergoes its particular transformation. Everyone in the room becomes briefly more present, more genuinely there. The management drops. The performance drops. What is left is just the people in the room and the new life that has just arrived, and the particular quality of the moment that makes all previous moments irrelevant. That quality, expanded from a room to a civilization, was what she understood as the direction, the quality of presence, actual, unmediated, undefended presence, the capacity to be in the world with others without the layer of management and performance and fear that most of human civilization had been organized to require. She understood that the children arriving, the ones already here and the ones preparing to come, carried this capacity more naturally than the generations before them. Not because they were better, because they had come prepared for a different moment. The previous generations had been prepared for the world as it was. These ones were prepared for the world as it needed to become. She stayed inside the gathering for what felt like the most important period of her entire experience. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was, she says, the most hopeful thing she has ever been inside. And she is a woman who has been inside 4,000 moments of arrival. She knows what hopeful looks like from the inside. She was told, in the way she had come to understand, that it was not her time, that she had things still to do at the threshold, that the work she had been doing, standing at the moment of arrival, being present for the crossing, was part of what the moment required. She understood this differently than she had understood her work before. She came back. She woke to Kenji's face. She told him what she had seen. 4 hours. When she finished, he told her about the juvenile corals. They were doing something the models had not predicted, adapting to changed water temperatures at a rate that the older individuals in the same reef system had not managed, as if they had come into the system already equipped for conditions that the previous generation had struggled to survive. Grace listened. She said, "They chose this reef." He said, "Corals don't choose." She said, "The ones I saw were choosing." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've been trying to explain the adaptation rate for 8 months. I haven't been able to." She said, "Maybe the explanation is in the choosing." He looked at her. He said, "That's not something I can publish." She said, "I know, but it might be something you can look for." He has been looking for it since. Grace returned to her practice 7 months after the hemorrhage. She stands at the threshold the same way she always has, with precision, with preparation, with the full weight of her training and experience brought to bear on the specific medical situation in front of her. But she stands there knowing something she did not know before. The consciousness arriving is not blank. It has been somewhere. It has chosen to come. This does not change how she manages a difficult delivery. The physiology is the physiology. The decisions are clinical. What it changes is how she is in the room. The way she speaks to the baby after arrival, not the professional reassurance she has always offered, but something more direct, an acknowledgement, a welcome that carries more weight than it used to. Her nurses have noticed. One of them asked her, 6 months after her return, whether something had changed. Grace said, "I have a better understanding of who I'm welcoming." The nurse said, "What do you mean?" Grace said, "I mean they've been somewhere. They know what they're doing. My job is to make sure the arrival goes as well as possible. The rest of it, what they're here for, what they bring, that's not something I'm responsible for. I just have to not get in the way." The nurse thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most terrifying and most comforting thing you've ever said to me." Grace said, "I know." She found the work of Dr. P.M.H. Atwater, a researcher who had spent decades studying near-death experiences specifically in children and who had documented across hundreds of cases a consistent pattern of children reporting memories of choosing their families, their circumstances, their specific entry point into physical life. The reports were consistent across cultures, across ages, across children who had no prior exposure to the concept of pre-birth choice, and whose accounts had been collected before they were old enough to have constructed a narrative around the experience. Children who remembered waiting, children who remembered choosing, children who described, with the specificity that young children sometimes bring to things they have not yet learned to doubt, the experience of deciding to come. Atwater had approached this research with the care of someone who understood how easily such accounts could be dismissed. She had documented them anyway, because the pattern across thousands of cases was too consistent to attribute to coincidence or suggestion. Grace read these accounts with the recognition of someone who had been to the place they were describing. Not similar to the place. The place. She had stood on the other side of the threshold. She had been among the ones who were preparing to cross. And what Atwater's young subjects remembered from their side of the arrival was consistent in structure and in quality with what Grace had witnessed from hers. She found the work of Dr. Ervin Laszlo, a philosopher of systems who had spent his career arguing that consciousness was not produced by individual brains, but was a property of a field that individuals accessed, and that the evolution of consciousness was not random but directional, moving toward greater complexity, greater coherence, greater capacity for connection. She found his framework for what he called the Akashic field, the information structure that, in his model, preserved everything that had ever occurred and from which consciousness drew both its history and its direction. She read him as someone who had been inside what he was theorizing about. The maps were imperfect. The territory was real. Grace Nakamura still delivers babies. She has now been at more than 4,500 thresholds. She stands at each one differently than she did before. Not with less clinical attention, with the same precision, the same preparation, the same full deployment of everything she knows, but with a quality she has been trying to name for 3 years and has recently settled on. Reverence. Not the reverence of someone performing a ritual, the reverence of someone who knows what they are in the presence of. She wants to say something directly to anyone watching this who has a child, or who is expecting a child, or who works with children or teaches them, or is responsible for them in any way. She says, the children arriving now are not a continuation of the previous pattern. She says, I don't mean this as a claim about their superiority or their perfection. Every generation has its challenges. Every generation falls short of what it came to do in ways that only become visible from a distance. She says, I mean that the baseline is different. The capacity they arrive with, the particular quality of awareness, of sensitivity, of refusal to accept the frameworks that previous generations accepted without question, that is not a problem to be managed. She pauses. She says, it is the point. She says, the world is going to change drastically, not because of a catastrophe, because of the people arriving in it, because of who they are and what they chose to come here to do. She pauses again. She says, I have been at more than 4,000 thresholds. I know what arrival looks like. I know the quality of a presence that is choosing to be here. She says, these ones are choosing. She says, pay attention to what they show you, because they came knowing something about where this is all going that the rest of us are still working out. The thumb for this episode says, everything will change. Everything will change. Grace Nakamura stood at the threshold for 21 years receiving the ones who arrived. She went to the other side and found the ones still preparing to cross. And what she brought back from that gathering was not a warning. It was something rarer, something this series has not offered before. Permission to be hopeful. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you see in the young people around you that the previous generation didn't have. I read everyone. I'm Alex. This is Beyond the Veil. And I'll see you in the next one.